Hey, Alex, you want to start a podcast?
Adam, that sounds like a great idea. How many episodes do you reckon we should make?
Oh, at least 400. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. It's our big 400th episode, and we
Hurrah!
and we've got an app jam-packed with news. I'm Alex Kidman, joined for the 400th time, wow, by Adam Turner. Hey Adam, this week Australian scientists managed to create a mix of human and mouse brain cells that could play Atari's classic game Pong. And you know they're Australian scientists because their next plan is to feed it beer. I'm not making that up either. Is this the future of esports or the end of humanity as we know it?
All I can say is that these scientists have obviously never watched Pinky in the Brain. I, for one, welcome our new rodent overlords.
All I can respond to that with is a hearty narf. It's been a big week in tech news, so we've caught up with a trio of Australia's best tech journos to dig behind the headlines. Firstly, Google announced last week, just as we were putting together our pack show, how rude, its new Pixel 7 devices. We caught up with EFTM's Dan Tyson to see how Google's latest flagship phones stack up. Firstly, Google announced last week, just as we were putting together our pack show, how rude, its new Pixel 7 devices. We caught up with EFTM's Dan Tyson to see how Google's latest flagship phones stack up. Welcome back to the show, Dan.
Always good to be back on here. How are you going, guys?
Good. Now, Google really didn't waste much time. I mean, we knew the Pixel 7 and the Pixel 7 Pro were coming, but they literally announced them last week. They're available this week. Were you surprised by the speed of delivery?
After 13 generations of Nexus and Pixel phones, they're finally getting it. We want them. I really was a bit surprised. I mean, Google's always had anywhere from a couple of weeks, anywhere up to a month, 2 months wait time from after the announcement. So I was quite pleasantly surprised to find you can actually get your hands on them this week.
The speed aside, a lot, and I mean, this seems to be a recurring theme anytime we talk to you about Android phones. A lot of detail around these phones had leaked. There weren't a great many big surprises that we didn't already know about.
No, I mean, Google was the primary leaker on this one themselves at Google I. It was like, here's the phones, here's what they look like, and they're going to run the next generation Tensor processor. I mean, well, okay, our job's done here. So, yeah it was not much to sort of get into, but they did pull out a lot of the features and sort of move more to the territory that a phone launch these days is getting more beyond the hardware and more into what the features are, and that's more important in what a phone is or their idea of a phone.
So, what were the features that really jumped out as new and interesting or new and improved?
So a lot of the features were around the camera for me. I mean, going into things like bringing back super res zoom for stuff like the Pixel 7 Pro was one of the big ones. But they've also got things like the AI related stuff, like the hold for me and stuff like that, where you can make a call and have it tell you where. I mean, that one's US only, but there were features that things like it can sit there and give you a phone tree when you go into an IVR, and you can actually get all the options available to you, so you can sort of skip all the voice
23795 real person, gotcha.
Yeah. Exactly. So, I mean, that seems to be what the story of the Pixel is this year. It's more about the software and the features rather than the hardware, although the Tensor G2 obviously is a bit of a story in and of itself. So that's
what
a new
is
one.
that, and what does it bring to the party?
So the new Tensor G2 is built on slightly newer architecture, although we were expecting a 4-nanometer process. It's actually built on the old 5-nanometer process, so there was a bit of a kerfuffle in the Android world about that when that was sort of confirmed by Google. But in terms of what it's bringing is they've improved the tensor processing unit on board, which is all the AI based stuff. So it can do improved like the speech recognition, which is almost, it is instant. I've yet to sort of trip it up, but things like that get powered. It's a little bit better performance. It's a little bit better. Well, I think they set up to 50% improvement in performance, and it's sort of going to give you slightly better battery life.
Now, Dan, that's an interesting one, and I do want to get back to the camera. I don't want us to forget that, but the battery life, because I've tested this, and I know you've tested
Mm,
this. Have you actually found that battery life better? Because I've
no.
got to be honest, I have not. Oh, good. I'm so glad you said that.
No.
No, I mean, I would say it's not bad, but it is not up there with the best in the premium space
No.
right now.
I like to give the company line first, and then we can go into
Hmm.
that. So, the company line is that it'll do all day battery life, and then it'll even do up to 3 days battery life if you want to enable the extreme battery saver, which is almost like, well, cutting yourself intentionally and going for a bath in alcohol. But it's really just not one of those things that I found improved. Like I can get a day out of it, which is for a modern day smartphone is what I want, because obviously most people are charging at the end of the day anyway, but it's still not living up to that big like day and a half, 2 day battery life that we're seeing out of some of the bigger like manufacturers. I mean, Apple gets sort of over that on some of their phones, and that's an easy sort of thing to do for them. But yeah, Google still hasn't nailed that more than a day battery life.
The Apple comparison's an interesting one as well, because as I've been testing this, what's really struck me, I like the 7 Pro. I think there's a lot to like about the
Mm,
7 Pro. But what's really been hitting me is this feels like an Apple experience. It's very much in the Google ecosystem and it's super controlled, especially around that camera. I said I'd get back to the camera because while the camera is really good, it's really good because you have to trust its post processing, how it
mm.
wants to do images.
That sounds very Apple.
Yeah, it very much is getting Google's view of the world when you take that photo. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like what the Tensor is doing, Google hasn't been super forthcoming on what's actually running the show there. They're still in their second generation of their own silicon, which we know is based on Samsung's Exynos architecture, going obviously ARM. But yeah, it's one of those things that we sort of have to wait and see. Like last year, like we sort of got this new Tensor processing unit. We didn't really have much to compare it to. This year we're on Tensor G2. We still don't have a lot to compare it to except last year's Pixel 6 Pro. And as you and I we found out, it's really not giving those huge important improvements in terms of battery life. Performance wise, I mean, subjective to everyone. I mean, I didn't see any problems. I tried all my usual tricks to get things to crash and overheat and do all that sort of stuff, but couldn't do it. So, in terms of that, it's yeah, I'm pretty happy with what they're doing. But yeah, battery life again, that's one of those stickers.
So, what makes the 7 Pro Pro?
So the 7 Pro gets a little bit of extra features in terms of the screen is larger, so you go to 6.7 inch. It's an LTPO screen. That's an Apple thing, which goes up to 120 hertz refresh, and it also gets a 48 megapixels camera sensor on the rear with a up to 5 times optical zoom.
And is that all new and improved for Google? Have we seen specs like that before?
Basically, we saw the LTPO screen last year, and we saw a zoom sensor on the 6 Pro, but it was only 4 times optical zoom. So they've now added a extra optical zoom, but they've also introduced this new super res zoom in the software, which can do a few extra features.
And I've got to say, actually, it's those extra features that have particularly impressed me at its price point. Because it does, as you say, it's 5 times optical and it'll do up to 30 times kind of hybrid digital, super zoom, call
Mm.
it what you will. And usually when you get that, because Samsung's done that and back in the day Huawei was doing that, I guess they still do, but very few people buy their
We just
phones.
don't see it.
Yeah. Um, but typically, when you blow it out to those really long distances, you end up with really garbagey looking shots that look like they were
Mm.
taken on a Commodore 64. But I've got to say, some of the shots I've been able to get with this thing have been really quite extraordinary for like handheld shots. You
Mm.
can see that they've been digitally smoothed in some ways, but they're much better than the competition. And the same is true at the other end because it's got this new macro mode as well.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't take a lot of macro shots. It's not something that's really in my wheelhouse. So every time I find a good macro mode, like the Find X3 last year had a really good macro mode, and getting to this was like just something interesting, and I sort of got a new view on life. So,
Mm.
but it also forces you to go, what do I need a macro camera for? And that's the sort of thing you got to work out what you can actually get up close to. So you got to things like obviously most people go for a picture of their eye and stuff like that, but Yeah, it's one of those things that I was a bit confused that people keep going in for the macro mode, and I don't see this big explosion of macro photography. What are your thoughts on that? I mean,
So we've had a lot of phones, and I mean a lot of
mm,
phones in the budget Android space, which have had with macro camera, and they're all pretty much the same awful 2 megapixel sensor. They all deliver really awful result. Or you've really got to fight to get a good result, I suppose. To be fair to them, you can get reasonable sort of macro shots, but it's hard work. And what I liked about this was that it was much easier work. I got much more pleasing photos. I think there are areas where macro makes sense. As you say, the eyeball is kind of one of your classics, but insects and flowers, close up of pets' faces and stuff like that, it's kind of cool and it's a different view on the world. And it even gives you creative ideas around photography. I'm really into cameras that encourage you to be creative, but this, I think, is also where that controlled thing sort of comes back because you've still got to accept Google's going to post process this. And if you're fast enough on most shots, you can actually see it do it. If you
mm.
jump into the shot right after you've taken it, you'll see the little processor wheel going, and then you'll see it snap to what it thinks the shot should be.
Yeah, it's that post processing of shots that's a little bit misleading because whether you're getting exactly what you saw in the viewfinder when you press the shutter button may not be exactly what was happening on in front of you when it actually took it. So, I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, obviously, one of the big things that they did was the blur feature. How did you go with the blurring and unblurring of photos, which is one of the features that sort of Google introduced with the Pixel 7? It allows you to sort of
Yeah.
unblur stuff that you've got in your camera roll from other
That's right.
devices. How did you sort of find that?
It's not great. Look, it's
No.
it's it's such a variable thing, and it's a very Photoshop-esque kind of feature. It's totally software. Let's face it. It does feel to me like it's one of those things they could probably at least bring to the Pixel 6, at least bring to that same tensor architecture. It might
Mm.
just run a little slower, but let's face it, all it's doing is image analysis. And what I found was it was kind of hard to find an image where it would apply the effect and do it in a way where I thought, yeah, that's what I wanted. A lot of the time, it either didn't really seem to do much at all, or didn't seem to be able to do much at all, or it gave me a result where it went, right, you've done something, but that just looks photoshopped. It looks fake as.
Mm. Yeah, that was one of my issues because I just delete blurry photos. I just don't keep them. So I was
It's usually
going
not
back through
worth
my
trying to
camera
save
roll
them.
going,
Yeah.
how do I find a blurry photo? So I was out there exciting the dog, trying to get her to sort of move around, and then I was taking them with Pixel 7. I went, oh, that's right, they've got the feature where you can't take a blurry photo, so I had to go and get another phone and try and take a picture of the dog all rolled up. So yeah, I mean, but I found, like you, Alex, I found it looked a little bit more photoshopped, and obviously Google's can improve all the software stuff as they go, so we may see improvements over time. But I was always struck when they were announcing it, going, oh, it's a tensor processing feature. And I went, well, aren't your data centers running tensor processing units? Couldn't we just run my photo library, my Google
Yeah.
Photos library through it? And then when I look at a photo that may be blurry, it pops up a thing going, would you like to see an unblurred?
But
Is
then you
it
wouldn't buy a phone, Dan. You wouldn't buy a phone.
Yeah, look, it's me. I would buy the phone.
is it unusual that they will let you apply this to photos that weren't taken on the device? Because I'm thinking of other software features they've done like this, like the ability to remove things in the background if you've
Hmm.
taken a nice shot and there's a person in the background. And I'm pretty sure from memory that that only worked if you'd taken the photo on that device. You couldn't just grab any photo. Is
No,
it rare for them to let you do it this way?
No, it's pretty standard for them to do the sort of pixel exclusive features. I mean, Magic Erase I applied to all my photos of like me in front of La Sagrada Familia in Spain and got rid of all the people, and that wasn't on a Pixel 6. So
Okay.
they do sort of allow that. But yeah, it sort of filters down to other models after a sort of a little bit of a grace period. So probably 6 to 12 months or something like that, we may see this roll out to other sort of phones as a feature, maybe the Pixel 6 Pro. But yeah, feature wise, I mean, they've done things like the Magic Erase, they've done things like the portrait mode, which you can apply to different phones, cameras, shots that you've got in your camera roll. So yeah, they do it, but they tend to go out a bit more broad after a little bit of time. So
They tend to fib a little bit. Let's be honest here.
yeah,
I mean,
I
I'm
mean,
thinking of like when they did the live street view thing where you hold your phone up and it
mm,
shows you your arrows and so on. If I remember correctly, and I might be getting the model wrong, I think that was Pixel 4a that came in on. I think that's
Yeah,
right,
I'd
about that
have to.
time frame. But
That's
that
sounds
was
about
that
right.
was said to be, oh no, this has to be exclusive to this. We can't run it on other stuff. And now literally anything that can run Google Maps can get that. They've kind of gone, yeah, look, actually, this is just software, and software is what Google does. But it's one of those things where they try and sell the phone as having this unique feature, but it's not really a feature, it's software. And actually, getting onto that, Dan, one of the other things they announced, which we haven't been able to test out yet, is that the Pixel phones will get a complimentary Google VPN sub.
Mm.
Now, VPNs are all about security and privacy. How wise is it giving over your security and privacy to Google, a company which wants to invade your privacy?
Are you saying I'm giving the keys to the banana plantation to the monkey?
I'm saying you're giving them to the world's biggest monkey,
Who's
Facebook
really just
aside,
wants every.
the 600-pound gorilla, literally.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can get the VPN now if you want to go and subscribe to a 2 terabyte data plan in Google One, but I'm not going to pay that sort of price for my data at this stage. So yeah, I'll sort of wait for the free VPN to roll out. We'll try it, but I think I might stick with my personally chosen VPN plan.
Well, the other side of the Google hardware story that they announced was the Pixel Watch. And again, no big secrets here. They'd shown it off. We sort of knew what was coming. You've been playing around with the Pixel Watch. I've been playing around and tested and reviewed the Pixel Watch. What do you think, Dan?
It's a lovely looking Fitbit.
Yeah, yeah. We have an accordance there.
Yeah, it's got all the features the Fitbit, although not all, which we might get into a little bit shortly. But it's very pretty to look at. The digital crown works really well. Obviously, it's running the new Wear OS 3.5, which Samsung's had the exclusives on for a year. Uh, Before I actually went to the announcement of the Pixel Watch, I thought I'll just go and see what Wear OS is like because I haven't used it in about a year because the last experience I had was pretty awful. So I went and charged up a watch, put it on my wrist, and it's still awful. So the going to the Pixel Watch with Wear OS 3.5 just sort of highlighted how bad Wear OS was on earlier watches. The experience on Pixel Watch is so much smoother, it's faster, it's so much nicer, and the hardware looks nice, but we've had years of looking at what Garmin and Apple's doing on their smartwatches, and it's sort of hard to wonder where some of those features are on this $549 watch.
Yeah, it's very version 1, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of those things where Fitbit sort of knows how to make hardware really well, but not great looking hardware. Google's got some pretty good skills in making things look good. Not great, but good. So it's sort of that Gen 1 of let's see what we can do and then sort of work on the feedback next year of what everyone finds they don't really like about it. So what are your top tips for what aren't they going to, what are the customers not going to like?
Look, honestly, I get what they've tried to do with the custom bands, for example, but and
Hmm.
I don't know if you actually adjusted or popped your band off or on,
Oh, yeah. Oh, I popped my
but
band.
it's a kerfuffle, and unfortunately, the standard they've got to live up to there is the Apple Watch,
Mm,
which is very very easy. Slide
mm.
bands on, slide bands off all day long. This thing took me way too long to work out. Right, this is how it works. And once I got it, I sort of got it, but it's clunky. I think that's slightly problematic. It's also a little odd, or I found it was a little odd, getting used to the rhythm of how you use that side button versus turning the digital crown versus pressing the digital crown and versus using a gesture. And every once in a while, I'd find myself in a little logic trap where I have to go, wait, what is it I want to do right now? How am I going to get back to what I want to see? Which, for a wearable, shouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's a little bit where we want to go, but we don't know how to get there. And that sort of seems to come across in the UI of the watch at the moment. I mean, it gives you all the data if you know how to get there, and it just takes a little bit of time to get used to the sort of the OS and way it's set up if you haven't used Wear OS before or if you haven't used it for a while. But you get there, but you do often, as you said, Alex, you're presented with these tiny little moments where it's like, uh, and then you sort of get back into your flow. But yeah, there is certainly times when you're sort of getting into a bit of a confused space, and that sort of needs to change before Wear OS 4 or whichever version they're going to do. So, yeah.
Is part of the problem that Google's been a bit hot and cold on Wear OS the same way as it is with most of the things it does?
Oh, just like tablets, say,
Yeah.
cloud gaming,
Yeah.
to go a little bit more topical. But yeah, it's one of those things that they sort of keep going hot and cold, and you see it in the apps that are available. Like you've had things like Telegram went into as a Wear OS app, and they just lost interest because Google lost interest, and then they pulled all their stuff out of the store. So you're not getting that sort of functionality, and now Google's got to go re-court these developers to bring their apps back to the store. There was a good array. Like it wasn't like you're reviewing like a Huawei smartwatch where you sort of go in and look at what apps are available, and it's pretty random third party ones that don't quite match up with what you want. There's some big names in there. You got your Spotify and Runtastic and stuff like that have apps. So it's one of those things that you sort of get the better experience of Google's has done this before, so they've got some of the groundwork laid out. But I think they're going to really need to knuckle down and give them more of a better experience in terms of what they're offering.
It'd be nice, I think, and this is actually broadly across smartwatches. And as regular listeners will know, I love a smartwatch. Adam has accused me of wearing multiples at once, more than once. But it would be nice if Google could come up with some new killer feature. Because as you say, this does all the basics, all the apps that you're likely to want are probably there. Maybe not as smooth and refined as they might be on some other platforms, but it'd be nice if they could come up with here is the next thing that a wearable needs, which is why you need a smartwatch. Because I don't dislike the Pixel Watch, but it's sort of yet another choice. There's beyond its pixely nature and it being a slightly more stylish Fitbit, there's not a lot there to sell it against a Galaxy Watch or against an Apple Watch. Although, of course, if you want an Apple Watch, that's iOS only, and the Pixel Watch is Android only.
Indeed, it is. Yeah, it sort of ties into more what they're doing in hardware because, I mean, you're right. Look, they need that killer feature that's like, this is why you buy the Pixel Watch. Google's decided to go with an ambient computing as that's why they're the reason you buy a Pixel phone, a Pixel Watch, and get into the Google ecosystem. But I think they need to do a little bit more on the hardware front. I mean, battery life, you're just getting through a day if you're not
Mm.
too active and stuff like that. The bezel on it is super large. If you're using the wrong watch face or using the wrong app, it certainly highlights how large a bezel it is on the watch. So I think these are some of the things they're going to have to look at in terms of hardware. They're going to have to get that battery life up there so they can support any new features that they want to launch. Especially things if they want to get into like blood pressure monitoring or something like that down the track for some of those premium features. So yeah, hardware I think is going to be the next thing they need to do next year to sort of do that.
So this is the flow on of Google buying Fitbit,
Mm,
yes?
yeah.
So if I'm a Fitbit owner and obviously an Android owner because this phone doesn't
Mhm.
work with iPhones, would I be thinking, oh, I'm going to move from Fitbit to this? Would it win you over? Or is there still enough things going on in Fitbits that you'd stay with your Fitbit?
I mean, I go with my wife on this. I have terrible style sense. So, what if she's interested in something? And when I had the Pixel Watch out of the box, she was like, "Oh, what's that?" And she's sort of never really been into fitness watches or anything like that. And she actually got interested. So, I'm thinking because she's used Fitbit before, she would be more inclined to go with the Pixel Watch because it looks great. I think it looks pretty decent. But again, my sense of style can be questioned at times. So I'm more inclined to look at things like the hardware as to how big the bezel is and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of style, it's going to win those Fitbit users over who sort of haven't had something that's great looking because she hasn't liked the look of the Fitbit, like the Versa and things
Yeah.
like that. They haven't been her cup of tea. So I think there's going to be quite a few people in the Fitbit ecosystem who've been wanting all that functionality, or most of it,
That's where
to
I'm
jump
going.
into something a bit more.
What
Yeah,
if you're one of the Fitbit faithful? What are you giving up by moving to this watch in terms of Fitbit features? How does the Pixel Watch lag behind?
it's missing out on the auto workout start. So if you go into the gym with your Fitbit on and start doing a gym workout, doing yoga, doing a run or something like that, there is actually auto workout detection. So that's missing from the
I
Pixel
would think
Watch.
that'd
And
be a pretty fundamental thing that
it
people would
is,
want.
especially like as you say, like with the Fitbit, like that's a particular user. And that's one of the features that most of them are going to be looking at. It's the fitness side of things. And if
Yeah.
it's not going to go and automatically start your system, then you're sort of missing out on a few things there. it's obviously Google's doesn't want to cut into their own lunch with their Fitbit market, that they may have left it out, but
That feels like a software feature, though. That does feel, because presumably that's just working off accelerometers and gyroscopes and
yeah.
so on. That feels like something that they could, hopefully will, throw in down the track.
And they definitely have had it in Android
Hmm.
Wear when it was Android Wear, and then removed it as a feature. Like you used to be able to just start a workout, and Google Fit would actually pick up that you'd started a workout. So it's certainly something that they can enable in software. So it may be one of those features that we may see based on feedback from users suddenly become available.
Okay, well, thanks so much for your time and insight, Dan. And you've been on the show many, many times before over its 400 episode history. You know what's coming. It's time once again for you to face up to the patented vertical hold 3 questions of doom. I will ask all three. You can answer them in any order you like. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And our current big contentious question: when you lay down the writing tools at the end of the week, what do you do to relax?
You can find my writing at EFTM.com. You can find me on social media all over the place as Frog Hollow, that's with a PH. And when I relax at the end of the day, it's usually with my son playing some games or something like that on the Xbox or the PlayStation or something. Yeah.
Family time. Excellent stuff. So thanks so much for your time. Next up, we caught up with AAP's Jen Dudley-Nicholson to talk the state of EVs in Australia and why Uber's getting involved. So, Jen, what's the Uber EV news over the week?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So what they've done is they've decided to pair up with Splend, which is an Australian company that typically deals with getting vehicles into the hands of rideshare drivers and then charging them for doing that. And they have managed to secure a suite of electric vehicles, essentially Polestar 2s in this case. And they've done that with help from the New South Wales state government. And Uber has paired with them to get a class of those, so 500 vehicles, and offer them directly to their rideshare drivers, which is an interesting way to kind of boost the number of electric vehicles on the roads.
So Uber's been talking about this for a while. They actually want to use electric vehicles as a selling point to end customers, don't they?
They do. So in 2023, they're planning a bit, I believe about halfway through the year, they're planning to launch something called Comfort Electric. So it will be just like Uber X or Uber Comfort. You'll be able to select an electric car to actually travel in underneath all of the options when you go to book your ride, essentially, because they think that they're attractive enough that people will select those as specifically to drive in, to ride in, as the case may be.
I, I would have thought the appeal of that kind of thing would need quite a big critical mass of vehicles, because I can't imagine too many Uber riders wanting to think, right, well, the nearest Polestar 2 is halfway across the city from me and I got a 2 hour wait. Or someone's got a little Nissan Micra I can jump in 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big problem is that just the number of electric vehicles that are around in Australia, and it's better in some states than in others. But certainly they're not a mainstream vehicle that you see on the streets everywhere at the moment. You'll see one and you'll point it out. Absolutely, it's around 3% at the market at the moment of the market of electric vehicles. But certainly there's a lot of room to grow. And this is one way that Uber's trying to push that out and to make it more mainstream. I think when we do see Comfort Electric come into the Uber pool, as it were, I think that you will see, an estimate of time and where those are, for example. So you'll be able to make a choice based on the cost of it and also how far away it is and how long it's going to take you to get one of these rides.
So when people think about fancy electric cars, they typically think about Teslas, and then the other ones they think about are your little Nissan Leafy kind of things. But Polestar's a new player in Australia, aren't they? And they want to play closer to that high end of the market, I think.
Absolutely. So from what I've seen so far, like these Polestar 2 vehicles, they cost around $67,000 on the road. So they're not a Nissan Leaf. They're much larger and much more Tesla-like. They look a little bit futuristic, and they're Swedish made. So they've got more in common with the Volvos of the world. Although slightly more attractive than that, I will have to say. Um, so yeah, these are sedans. These are luxury sedans essentially, and they run off electric batteries. They're not a hybrid vehicle, so they'll have to be charged.
I should point out, Polestar is not coming to Australia as part of this Uber EV deal. They've been selling the Polestar 2 here locally for some time. And actually, this week, they even announced the Polestar 3, although that's a much more expensive vehicle. And I don't think we're down on track to see it till at least 2023, maybe even 2024.
And I think that's one of the things that Uber and a lot of different players in this space are trying to tackle. Essentially, that Australia is not getting these electric vehicles when they launch. We have to wait much longer to see any sort of vehicles come out here. There are some that are available overseas and that are not available in Australia right now. And that's according to a lot of the people I've been speaking to this week, just because we don't have the right fuel efficiency standards in place that would encourage these manufacturers to actually bring them to Australia in the first place. Because there's cars at the moment that some of the big makers can't sell in places like Europe anymore, but they can sell in Australia. And so, with that being the case, why would you sell your fancy EVs out here when you could sell the other ones that you can't sell elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about fuel efficiency standards with Zach from Gizmodo a couple of weeks ago, actually. So this is obviously a big problem. Is there any indication? Because I know there's been various state government pushes to get lots of big EV buys up for their department cars and so on. And the idea or the benefit for the end consumer there is not so much that your local MP is whizzing around in an EV, although oddly mine is, but more that in 3 to 4 years, those will then become secondhand, slightly more affordable EVs. Is there any indication that these Uber EVs, if we want to call them that, will go down that path as well?
Look, absolutely, it's possible, and I think one of the things is also kind of getting people familiar with electric vehicles and what they look like and what they feel like and how they are to ride in. A lot of people, this for a lot of people, this will be their first exposure to riding in an electric vehicle. So, to use a really close to home analogy, my husband caught an Uber the other day that was in a Tesla, and he raved about it for a full week. And he told all of his mates about it, and I think that sort of creates the good word of mouth that some of these companies are after as well. And that also sort of speeds up our transition to electric vehicles because you're not going to buy one if you've never come across them and you've never read about them before. Whereas if you've caught, potentially an Uber in a Polestar, you might think, okay, well, that's shaped my opinion of that. I mean, it can shape it for good or bad. It depends on the experience that you have in that particular Uber ride. But potentially this is bringing in a whole new audience as well as feeding that secondhand market.
There's also talk that we're going to start to see EV utes in Australia. Now, at one time they were supposedly going to kill the weekend. Are we still looking at it that way? Do you think is there a demand for utes in Australia?
I think there's a demand for utes just in general in Australia, and absolutely electric utes will have to be part of that conversation. I think that there's a lot of different parts to this as well. Like obviously have to be able to charge your EV ute, and you have to be able to charge it in places where you would use a ute. And so for some people in regional Queensland, they have a lot of questions about that. In regional Australia, they have a lot of questions about, where they can plug these things in, what the range is of some of these utes, and also just getting them to Australia is complicated as well. However, they are being made now. So potentially we could see some of these starting from next year become more widespread and more used. I think if you win over the tradie market, you've potentially won over quite a lot of Australia too.
And realistically, a lot of tradies are only doing city driving anyway.
Certainly, I've seen a lot through the city, absolutely,
Hmm.
and around 3 o'clock and quite fast. I think that it comes to actually being able to haul larger loads in the back
Oh
of
yeah.
those utes, which absolutely plays into, why you'd have a dedicated car for those sorts of things. You can't just shovel your equipment in the back of a Tesla sedan and hope for the best. So yeah, there's definitely a need for them, but we are seeing that they are coming out to Australia. They are on the market overseas already. I don't think that the end of the weekend is nigh.
Yeah, look, I mean, I can give some interesting insight on this because this came up actually a couple of episodes ago when we were last talking EVs, and I was due to do the PAX rundown. And Adam, you queried me on the whole charging and how that would work and how that went. And then having done it and having returned, I can say it went quite well. The infrastructure could be more definitely. And to be clear, I was driving in a Tesla, which meant I could use their charging network. But outside of this, and to give a lot of credit to Victoria, I had a lot of options, especially in Melbourne. Melbourne's rather nicely situated for that kind of charging stuff. But even out in regional areas, I found around the time I wanted to swap drivers, about 2 hours or so, which is your general safety recommendation, was pretty much where I could find a charger. It can work. It definitely can.
Yeah, and I think those sorts of experiences are going to play into when Australia actually gets electric vehicles and when people start to make the transition. But also, hopefully, we'll see more of that as well, and there'll be more people having conversations about where they've charged, how their road trips went, and their experiences in EVs.
So, how's the big picture looking for EV take up in Australia at the moment?
I think it's one of those cases where there's a lot of demand, and we're starting to see that reflect in sales figures. So obviously, this depends on whether you can actually get access to an EV to purchase it.
Mm.
But we've seen record sales figures in September, according to the latest VFAX data. And also, it's worth mentioning that electric vehicles actually outsold hybrid vehicles and hybrid plug-in vehicles combined. So the market is definitely headed that way. But in a new report that's just come out this week called "The State of EVs" by the EV Council, they've said that it's up 65%. Sales of electric cars, in particular, are up 65% in Australia over the past year, which is a huge deal, even though that is from a low base. And also, the number of electric vehicle charging stations has also increased by 22%. And so we're starting to see those things trickle through. What was really interesting for me in this report too was the Tesla Model Y, which only came out in August, is already the second biggest selling electric vehicle in Australia. So there was obviously a lot of pent up demand for that particular model. Tesla does sell well in Australia in terms of electric vehicles, absolutely. But I just thought it was really interesting and kind of demonstrated for me the demand for these devices if we can actually get them to Australia.
The Model Y certainly isn't cheap. I'd be curious to know where the Model 3, which is their theoretically affordable, it's still ruddy expensive, model sat in that, and especially some of the newer players like BYD, because they're playing more towards the lower but still expensive end of the EV pool.
Yeah, well, interestingly, so the Model 3, it made up, according to this State of EV report, it made up 1 in 3 sales of electric
Ooh.
vehicles. So, yeah, affordable EVs are definitely kind of the way that we're headed and the way that Australians think with their wallets and when they're purchasing electric vehicles. And I think that there's also room for others. So we saw MG and
Hmm.
Hyundai also rank in that list. And I think that MG actually has one of the cheapest electric vehicles that you can buy in Australia at the moment at just under $50,000. So that probably isn't too surprising either.
Now, Jen, you've been on the show before many, many times, albeit wearing a slightly different hat. Uh, and you know it's time for you to face the patented vertical hold 3 questions of doom that everybody loves. I'll ask all 3 questions and you can answer them in any order you like. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And our current contentious question: when the time comes at the end of the working week to lay down your writing tools, what's your go to activity for relaxing?
Wow. Well, I like to relax by staring into space and potentially at Twitter and just like doom scrolling. I don't know that that's healthy, and you definitely shouldn't do that at home, kids. So obviously on the web you can find me on Twitter at Jen Dudley, where I live and I tweet a whole bunch of my stories. And in terms of AAP, you can find my work on aap.com.au, but also syndicated all around the place, including this week I ended up on the Australian Financial Review. So hi to those guys too.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Jen.
Thank you.
And finally, it's not just Google and Apple that get to have big, flashy product launches, because this week, Microsoft showed off a range of new Surface devices. And to dig beneath the surface, we're joined by Finder's Angus Kidman. So, Gus, Microsoft holds these Surface events basically sort of annually, and often they are spec upgrades. They're just, here's the latest Intel processors, the same way that a Dell or an HP or anyone else might do with their latest laptops. Is that what we've seen in these new Surface Pro models?
It's certainly part of it. We've seen the traditional shift up in the processor we've got, but we have seen a few interesting, broader changes across the range, perhaps that we didn't expect. At the same time, not necessarily anything you can get mega excited about. So we saw this interesting divide in the kind of main Surface Pro range, where previously there'd been a couple of branches of this, and which processor you chose actually changed the actual label on the box. And now they've kind of called it all one family, and you've got to dig in and find out what the processor is. So, Alex, you're the expert on this. You want to talk through that?
Yeah, so okay, so previously you had the Surface Pro line, which were Intel machines, basically, standard x86 architecture, and the Surface Pro X, which was their ARM architecture, running a custom Qualcomm processor. And they have a custom Qualcomm processor in the Surface Pro 9 now, the QC3, I think it is. But it's not called the Surface Pro X anymore. This is still just the Surface Pro 9, but it's the Surface Pro 9 5G. So that model has Windows 11 ARM, whereas the Surface Pro 9 has a 12th gen Intel Core i5 or i7 processor. Gus, I know you're someone who, started out with Windows ARM at least back as far back as the original and terrible Surface RT model. What are the challenges with ARM and Windows?
Well, so the big challenge with ARM on Windows is some of the apps work like you're putting them into a concrete mixer, basically, like you just don't have.
If they work at all.
If they work at all. And some of them just don't come in there. So it's always been a tough sell, and I think it still leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. The sell for this model, is that you get much better battery life. Microsoft's claiming 3 hours more if you're running it. We'll have to see how that works out actually in the tests. So I don't know that would be enough to persuade me to make that shift. I still feel like if I was going to go for one of these devices, and to be clear, I would not, then I would still go for the Intel model because I'd have better software compatibility going on and potentially better processing power. It's interesting. It does line up with a few weeks ago. We're talking about how Intel's trying to bury the distinction between its chips, and it feels like Microsoft is lining up with them on that journey by not talking about the chips too much in the name as well.
Yeah, but there's a big difference between not telling you the difference between Celeron and Pentium and not telling you the difference between ARM and x86 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So who is the ARM version for? Who would you recommend it for?
I guess if you really wanted that 5G support, if you're one of those people who says, I really am using this tablet device on the road a lot, I want that built-in support, or if you were an absolute battery hog, maybe you're only using a few apps and you think, I just want this to run as long as possible, I guess that's an incentive. But honestly, I feel like in that space, there are probably other ways of approaching this that would get you a better solution there. So I'm not quite sure where they think that one's going to land. Whereas if you consider the Intel version to be the mainstream Surface Pro, that's going to be, if the Surface Pro seemed like a good idea to you, then may as well go for the newest model, get the most grunt in it. But I think it stays within that specific segment.
What actually really does get to me as well is the price difference, because the 5G model is significantly more expensive, to the point where you could pick up a cheap 5G Android phone and pair it with the Surface Pro 9 and still potentially come out in front. You wouldn't necessarily get that 3 hours extra battery life, but that's the classic up to 3 hours extra battery life. It's not, we guarantee this will do this much more. So until we can actually test those, until we can work out, hey, this is how that works, this is what it actually delivers in real world usage. I'm with Gus. I'd be opting for the Intel model, and of course putting a few extra pennies aside for the keyboard, because it still ain't standard.
Yeah. So the ARM model is the only one that has built-in 5G. All the other ones have built-in 4G?
No, the other ones are Wi-Fi only. If you want a mobile SIM version, you're going to have to buy the 5G version, as I read the spec sheet. Yeah.
Is that a bit of a dick move? Like, why are they doing that apart from the fact they want to push the ARM models? Why would you make that kind of distinction?
Well, there's not that many Windows laptops that have really gone down that mobile SIM route, because fairly logically, it's quite battery sapping. Like, it really does hit the battery life pretty hard, because you're generally speaking running Wi-Fi anyway. You add a mobile radio onto that, and not only do you have to build it in there and work out how it's going to work within RF interference and all of those kinds of variables, you've also got to then give it more battery space. Everyone wants thinner and lighter systems, not big, chunky, heavy bastards. And it becomes a problem. So it's not super commonplace. They're not actually doing something that others aren't doing here, outside of the ARM factor of all of it. But as I say, I mean, actually pairing up a phone to a tablet or a laptop, I don't feel like it's that hard a thing. That is the route I would go. I'd be interested if any of the listeners have a different perspective on that, of course.
Now, the one thing that's interesting that's also missing from both models, whether you go Intel or ARM, is that Microsoft has jumped on the bandwagon. There is no headphone jack in the Surface Pro anymore. They've just said, no, we're not going to go down that path. Now, again, we're familiar with this with phones. We've lived through this. We've got used to the idea that now we're all throwing in adapters or just working off Bluetooth. But I will say, I think on a device that's supposed to be used as a laptop some of the time, which is not the thinnest or smallest thing in the world, and let's face it, the component for that must cost them cents. It's not expensive putting in a 3.5mm jack. They've been around for a while. That does seem to me like a bit of an odd omission.
And also, if you're someone who worked with multimedia and you'd invested in decent headphones, or like we're recording now over Zencaster, and we know it can be a little bit fussy when it comes to using Bluetooth
Shh,
headphones.
don't taunt it, Adam.
So there are reasons why some people would still want to, plug in headphones to a notebook.
And there's another problem there as well, just in terms of the way notebooks generally handle that port. For a lot of those notebooks, it's actually a combo port. It's not just a headphone port. Often it's a combo headphone and microphone port. And people might have workflows built around that as well. Gus, we also saw a new Surface laptop, the Surface Laptop 5. Anything particularly exciting or notable there?
Well, it's got a headphone jack in it. So
Huzzah.
And I believe it's now available in Sage. Like, honestly, my feeling was looking at the laptop. And to be clear, if I bought a Surface, the laptop is what I would buy, because as someone who literally has their device on my lap a lot, the kickstand just doesn't work. Like, even on planes, the kickstand is not great. So that wouldn't be the use case for me. I looked at for me, the Surface laptop was okay. It's this year's model, but it's very much just incremental upgrade. Really, not much that you could get excited about. In that, again, if it's the device you wanted, if that's the Surface form factor you want, may as well buy the newest one. But I didn't, unless I didn't read the tea leaves of the press release and the spec sheet in enough depth. That one really didn't fire it up. I just thought, okay, it signifies that they're continuing the range. At least they're doing an upgrade. They're not doing the Apple of saying, hey, well, we're going to leave this thing on the market for 3 years with the same processor, and you'll never know when the next one's coming. So I guess I'll give them points for regularity.
How does it stack up price-wise compared to what you can get for that kind of money from the other hardware makers?
It's a bit much of a muchness. So Microsoft sells themselves as a bit of a premium brand, and there is something, I think, to the style of the Surface laptop. I quite like the visual style of that thing. But ultimately, there's with new machines, less so with old ones where you can sometimes score a bargain, because they're all getting the components from the same place, and because they're actually being pumped out from, I think it's about 3 different factories worldwide, not much more than that. There's not so much room for manufacturers to really say, right, this for a standard sort of laptop, and Microsoft will undoubtedly disagree with me, but the laptop 5 is a standard sort of laptop. It doesn't have funky integrated OLED screens. It's not a gaming laptop. It doesn't have some weird new form factor that no one's ever thought of before. It's a fairly standard laptop. For those, there's only so much price wriggle room, and Microsoft knows this as well, because if they suddenly said, oh, but our model is $3,000 more, nobody's going to buy it.
It's not a Mac.
Well, let's not get hasty. But yeah, realistically, there are going to be similarly competitive models with similar specs that you're going to get from your Dells or your HPs. You're still sitting a bit below the actual premium end of this space, which in my head remains permanently occupied by the higher end ThinkPad Carbon and things of that ilk. That's when you're getting a real, genuine kind of sleek, nice machine. So I think, they're going to do okay with the Surface laptop. I think it will continue to occupy the space in the market, but I don't see it massively disrupting with this particular upgrade.
Well, speaking of niches and like market segments, they also had the new Surface Studio 2 Plus. Now, that's a real niche machine. It's an all-in-one for designers that tilts down with a touchscreen. And it's also the sequel to something that they hadn't actually updated for a number of years.
Yes, I think it's 3 years since we last saw the previous model. And this one's a real oddity. And the way you're squeezed into that niche, I guess, is, okay, you can have actual laptop sort of processing power in a touchscreen thing that can also act like, and this is where the gap is, because realistically, as we all know, designers want to use Macs. Like, it's really hard to persuade them to use anything else. So it's only in that touchscreen space that you might get them. And then I think some of them go, oh, look, when I want to do that, I'm just going to sit down with my iPad or maybe my Wacom or something. But like, yeah, on the whole, this is one of those things where the fact they're doing it again suggests maybe they think they can sell some of them, but I'm struggling to see this thing taking off.
As the all-in-one space, I mean, I know that Apple's done well with iMac, but outside of that, is it ever been a big market?
I don't know of any specific figures, to be clear. Every once in a while, it seems like a different vendor, an HP or a Dell or whatever, will say, "Hey, look, here's our version of this," and it's there. And I think there are people for whom that model suits and for whom that model has a lot of appeal. If you don't want that kind of tech cluttered thing going on, or in the case of the Surface Studio 2 Plus, if you do want that design and touchscreen thing, which to be fair, on an iMac you wouldn't get. There's no touchscreen iMacs out there. I think there's maybe space for it, but it's small space for sure. You definitely see most makers really shifting many more laptops and then the odd desktop box here and there to very specific customers.
I wonder if it's a retail strategy. This is a weird, funky looking thing that Microsoft are going to be able to have sitting in the Microsoft store, and it won't look like anything else you've seen before. So it's that weird thing you're walking to look at, but then actually go, well, look, hang on, I wouldn't need one of those. But hey, maybe what about this Surface? So I genuinely think there's a tiny bit of that going on.
Speaking of iMacs, as we were, Microsoft also mentioned Apple at a Surface event. And let's face it, except in perhaps maybe, comparative terms that made Microsoft look good, I don't think I've ever heard them mention Apple before. Specifically speaking, they're going to start integrating iCloud photos into the Photos app for Windows 11. Gus, do you think there's an awful lot of iPhone owners out there who use iCloud who wanted to use photos on Windows 11?
50% of the market, roughly, in Australia is iPhones. So, yeah, there's a genuine sense that for people who've decided that's their phone, but who haven't gone full ecosystem and gone to Mac, you might as well make it a bit easier. Like, obviously, for years, Microsoft has wanted people to go into OneDrive. That's where they'd like them to do. But I actually think there's some merit in going, hey, look, we might as well play nice with the other big people in our field. As you say, they haven't done it for a long time. I can remember, because I'm such an old man, the press conference at which, it was announced that Microsoft was investing in Apple and was porting over Office, and we're talking late 90s here. And ironically, one of the things that saved the company. So it hasn't been quite that long since, but it's been a while. In this case, for me, I don't know it's a massive audience, but it's not a move that seems completely stupid.
Is it the kind of thing that could get iPhone owners to then take a second look at OneDrive and then gradually bring them more into that Microsoft ecosystem of apps and services, even if they're still using the Apple hardware?
I don't know, because if you're using Photos and you say, hey, you're syncing with iCloud, you're probably not going to, you're then going to do that. Like, I don't know how often they'll go, hey, you could do this better on OneDrive. I'm sure there'll be a set of sneaky pop-up notifications, because Microsoft does love a sneaky pop-up notification. And as part of my Windows configuration is always disabling as many of those as possible. So, look, yeah, I think it's a foot in the door, but I think hopefully Microsoft has now learned that the phone space is just not where it's going. So maybe it is time to say, hey, we can't win this battle. Let's make sure we're appealing to as many customers of many phones as possible.
They also launched some AI optimized software, Microsoft Designer, which is coming to, I think it's Microsoft 365 and eventually to Chrome and even Bing. This idea of, right, if I type in, I want an image of Adam being skewered 50 times through each side of his head. Did I say that out loud? I did. If I needed that image for some reason, shall we say, then Microsoft Designer would make it for me. We've seen a lot of this kind of AI art stuff. Is Microsoft just trying to own this space?
They're owning it like they own the search space with Bing, is my confident prediction. Yeah, it makes sense. It's an area where people are interested, but I think in that space, and yeah, they've got a big tools audience. Plenty of people still use 365. Why not have a go at it? They've got enough money to get away with that. But the proof will be in what gets rolled out and how realistic those spikes going through Adam's head actually look.
I'm hoping for maximum realism. Adam is not. So, Gus, it's time once again for you to face up to the vertical hold 3 questions of doom. You've been here many times. You know the score. I will ask you all 3 questions. You can answer them in any order you like. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find your social media online? And our current big contentious question, when you lay down the writing tools at the end of a busy working week, apart from listening to ABBA, what's your go-to activity to wind down?
So you can find my work at finder.com.au. You can find me ranting on Twitter at GusWorldAU and reinforcing my status as, the oldest man in podcasting, certainly the oldest man on this podcast. The thing I like to relax with and I want to step away from technology, not do anything at all, is a good old-fashioned logic puzzle. One of those ones where they give you like 20 conditions and say, here's 5 people and they did 5 things in 5 places and we tell you 3 things
The
about
train
them.
leaving Manchester and the train leaving Liverpool.
That
travelling at 50
kind of
miles
thing.
an hour
So-
kind of thing.
Half the listeners have no idea what I'm talking about, but like
Ed
generally,
was wearing a blue hat and Jenny
Yes.
had a handbag and how do you... Yeah, I remember those things from when I was a kid.
exactly. So like, no, still into those. You can still find them in print magazines. You can search and find them online. But I'm
Sorry,
not doing
what
that.
magazines?
Yeah. You remember print?
I
was a
do
thing
remember.
once,
I
Adam.
think we all made money out of print once.
Well, that just about wraps up the very special 400th episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to all of our guests for joining us, not just this week's guest, but the many, many fine Australian and international guests we've had on the show over 400 episodes. And thanks, of course, to you, the listeners, because we couldn't and wouldn't make this show without you. If you ever want to get in touch, if you ever want to give us some feedback on this show or any other or anything you'd like us to cover, catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at the Vertical Hold Facebook page, or on the web at verticalhold.com.au.
And as always, thanks for dropping by. Thanks for hanging around for 400 episodes. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, tell your enemies about us, and help us spread the good word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.